May 1945. Rimini POW camp, British sector, northern Italy. The concrete floor is cold. She can feel it through her knees. A young German woman, no more than 22, kneels motionless beneath the harsh floodlight of the barracks washroom. Her Luftwaffe auxiliary badge has already been stripped. Her name is no longer used. A British military nurse, expression unreadable, stands above her with a pair of dull scissors. The blades open and close with a slow metallic rasp. A thick golden strand of hair falls to the ground. Then another, in silence. Behind her, 6 more women wait their turn, their faces pale with dread. The scent of disinfectant and cigarette smoke fills the room. Somewhere outside, a generator hums and trucks roll over gravel. The war is over, but the humiliation is just beginning. The camp commander had issued the order 2 hours earlier. All German women prisoners were to have their hair cut short, regulation length, as part of a delousing measure. But to the women, it was something else, a punishment, a public stripping of dignity. And as her braids fall to the floor, she knows she is no longer an enemy soldier. She is now a prisoner without a face. By the final months of World War II, Germany was collapsing on all fronts. In the east, the Red Army was tearing through Prussia and Silesia with unstoppable momentum. In the west, American, British, and Canadian forces had pushed across the Rhine and were converging deep into the heart of the Reich. By April 1945, Berlin was encircled. Adolf Hitler had withdrawn underground, issuing desperate commands to ghost divisions that no longer existed. Across every front line, the Third Reich's military machine was being ground into dust. But what's often forgotten is this. Not all of those surrendering in the chaos were men. Tens of thousands of women, uniformed, trained, and officially attached to the Nazi war effort, were now caught in the crumbling framework of defeat. These women had served in various roles across the military and Nazi bureaucracy. Some were members of the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe auxiliaries, operating radios, logistics stations, and anti-aircraft batteries. Others were part of the SS Helferinnenkorps, working in administrative and camp guard functions. And thousands more had staffed Nazi offices, war hospitals, and munitions factories. In Hitler's total war, everybody counted, and by 1944, even conservative Nazi ideology had embraced women in uniform. When surrender came, these women found themselves trapped between collapsing German units and advancing Allied columns. Most were captured in hastily assembled camps in Austria, France, Italy, and southern Germany. The Allies, initially overwhelmed by the sheer volume of prisoners, struggled to categorize them. Were they civilians, collaborators, soldiers, war criminals? In the fog of surrender, women were often rounded up indiscriminately. A large number of these female POWs were concentrated in transit camps and depots controlled by the British and Americans, such as Camp 227 in France, Rimini in Italy, or Garmisch in southern Germany. In the East, Soviet forces treated German women with an entirely different and often brutal approach, but the Western Allies maintained formal military detention protocols. Still, there was confusion. In the eyes of their captors, these women posed an awkward question. They had worn uniforms. Some had carried rank. Others had processed prisoner files or tracked Allied bomber raids from bunkers. But under the Geneva Convention, combatant status for women was ambiguous. The Allies had rarely encountered such large-scale female participation in enemy logistics and military infrastructure. There were no clear precedents. So, they created new categories. Female military auxiliaries, SS female staff, non-combat, political sympathizer, low threat. But no matter what the label said, the result was the same. Detention, interrogation, isolation, and in some camps, physical humiliation. The logic was bureaucratic. The experience was deeply personal. For the women who had joined the Nazi war machine, some willingly, others by conscription, surrender was not just military defeat. It was moral collapse. And when Allied guards began issuing rules about uniforms, posture, discipline, and even appearance, it felt like being unmade, especially when the order came, "Cut your hair." All of it. Because in the culture they had come from, hair was more than hygiene. It was identity, femininity, pride, obedience, loyalty. Cutting it was not just policy. It was symbolic. And for many German women, it was the first time they understood what defeat really meant. When the Allied armies began detaining German women en masse in the spring and summer of 1945, they were not prepared for the scale, complexity, or sensitivity of what lay ahead. Tens of thousands of women, many in uniform, others in administrative roles, were now under Allied control. Their status was unclear. Unlike male Wehrmacht prisoners, whose role as combatants was easily verified, female prisoners fell into murky categories: part soldier, part civilian, sometimes voluntary, sometimes conscripted. The result was a patchwork of ad hoc policies implemented differently across each zone of occupation. In the American and British sectors, especially in Germany, Austria, and Italy, female POWs were segregated into specialized camps or placed in female-only barracks inside larger detention centers. Camp 2227 in Rennes, France, and Camp Rimini in Italy were among the best documented examples. These facilities were austere, hastily constructed, and designed for short-term holding, but many women would remain detained there for months, some over a year. The official Allied policy emphasized 4 objectives. Classification. Was the prisoner a combatant, collaborator, propagandist, or bystander? Interrogators pored through captured documents, rosters, and testimonies. Security, prevent escape or regrouping of Nazi sympathizers. Female prisoners were seen as capable of maintaining ideological resistance. Denazification, expose, shame, and neutralize Nazi loyalties through education, film screenings, and resocialization. Hygiene and order, ensure camp cleanliness in crowded, lice-prone conditions. This last point would become one of the most visible and controversial parts of the female POW experience. Across multiple camps, particularly in British-controlled sectors, women were ordered to cut their hair short, often forcibly. The stated reason was clear: delousing. After years of total war, lice infestations were rampant. Camps were breeding grounds for typhus, and hair was an efficient vector. But the action carried emotional weight. In German society, especially under the Nazi regime, a woman's hair was heavily politicized. Long braided hair symbolized Aryan purity, loyalty, discipline, and motherhood. Hitler Youth posters and propaganda films portrayed the ideal German woman as strong, silent, and physically modest, her long hair tied with patriotic ribbons, her demeanor serene and fertile. To have it removed by foreign captors was not just uncomfortable, it was shattering. Women wept, some resisted, others begged for scissors so they could cut their own hair before the guards did. Camp logs from Rimini and Rennes record cases of emotional breakdowns, self-harm, even suicide following this procedure. The British nurse Nellie Wright, posted at Rimini in May 1945, wrote, "They came one by one. Some clutched prayer beads, others stared blankly. We told them it was for hygiene, but none of us missed what it meant to them." Not all haircutting was forced. In some camps, prisoners were given a choice: compliance or solitary confinement. In others, it was non-negotiable. In rare cases, especially involving former female guards from SS units, the shaving of heads was public and punitive. meant to expose shame and invite humiliation from others. Yet the line between sanitary policy and psychological punishment remained thin. Beyond hair, the uniform policy also played a central role in identity erasure. Upon capture, German women in military uniform were stripped of insignia. Their belts, boots, and medals were confiscated. In some camps, they were issued shapeless work garments, often borrowed from surplus Red Cross or British depot stocks, ill-fitting, genderless, gray, or brown. There were no mirrors in most camps. One former air signal auxiliary later recalled in her post-war diary, "I looked at my reflection in a tea kettle. I did not recognize myself. My braid was gone, my jacket was gone, my voice no longer had rank. I was no one haircutting also marked a threshold." A prelude to another Allied objective: re-education. In the weeks that followed, captured German women were shown footage of liberated concentration camps. They were asked to write essays denouncing Nazism. Lectures on democracy were broadcast via loudspeakers. Interrogators, many of whom were women themselves, questioned the prisoners' beliefs, family backgrounds, and wartime duties. It was not just about defeating Germany. It was about rebuilding German women from scratch. The camps were quiet, efficient, controlled, but behind the silence lay thousands of small battles, battles of memory, pride, and resistance, fought not with rifles, but with scissors and silence. And as the first strands of hair began to fall in camps across Europe, the emotional war for identity had begun. The order to cut hair, simple on paper, detonated like an emotional grenade in the minds of many captured German women. To the British or American officers issuing the instruction, it may have seemed routine. A health protocol, a line item in camp sanitation guidelines. But to the women kneeling on stools under flickering bulbs in drafty barrack rooms, it cut deeper than scissors ever could. This was not just the severing of hair. It was the severing of identity. In Nazi Germany, a woman's hair carried immense symbolic weight. The Third Reich, despite thrusting women into war support roles, still propagated the image of the ideal German woman: healthy, modest, loyal, and, above all, feminine. Visual propaganda celebrated this femininity. Braids, buns, and long flowing hair were markers of racial purity and national devotion. Posters encouraging childbirth and loyalty to the Führer often portrayed young women with precisely maintained hairstyles, practical but never masculine. Hair was not vanity, it was virtue, and so, when Allied guards ordered women to submit to cutting, sometimes shaving, it triggered a collapse in personal and ideological stability. One German prisoner, formerly an administrative assistant with the Waffen-SS, recalled years later, "When they cut my braid, it felt like they were cutting away everything I had believed in. Everything I had been told was right." In the structured world of Nazi military auxiliaries, hierarchy mattered. Many of these women had trained under strict discipline, memorized codes, held rank, and even commanded subordinate staff. Their uniforms, and by extension their appearance, were not fashion but authority. When Allied policy stripped them of insignia, placed them in rough cotton shifts, and sheared their hair, they didn't just feel like prisoners, they felt erased. Psychological interviews conducted in 1946 by Allied interrogators at several camps observed a pattern. Women disassociated, spoke in third person, or referred to their hair loss as the real surrender. It was the moment they could no longer pretend the war wasn't over. A nurse working at Camp 2227 in Rennes noted, "Many of the women showed no reaction to food rationing, cold floors, or even interrogations. But once the clippers touched their necks, they cried. Some for hours hair, a silent companion through years of war, had become the final link to a lost world. Its removal was a symbolic execution of everything they thought they were. From a moral standpoint, the policy remains divisive. Allied officials maintained it was hygienic necessity. Post-war documentation from British Army Health Divisions show that lice outbreaks were widespread, and typhus remained a real threat in overcrowded camps. In that context, cutting hair was a public health safeguard, no different than mass DDT spraying or soap inspections. But the lack of sensitivity, especially given the cultural weight of the act, raised ethical questions even among the Allied staff themselves. Some officers protested the practice. Others noted that male prisoners were often given minimal hair trims or left untouched unless infected. The disparity between male and female treatment, particularly the public nature of the act, sparked quiet discontent within certain Allied circles. There is no evidence that the practice was officially intended to shame, but in effect, it often did. German women, regardless of whether they had personally committed war crimes, were being processed through a system designed not just to contain, but to confront them with guilt. Haircutting became a ritual of surrender, repeated in camp after camp with silent precision. For some, it was justice. For others, it was humiliation masquerading as policy. Most of what we know about these moments comes not from Allied reports, but from rare memoirs and interviews. Post-war German literature, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, barely touched the subject. Female veterans, whether nurses, clerks, or radio operators, were often shunned in post-war society, accused of complicity, and expected to remain silent. But a few accounts broke through. In 1974, former Luftwaffe auxiliary Hilde K., who had been held at Camp Rimini, published her wartime memoirs. In one chapter she wrote, "I sat on a bench. I heard a British woman speak. I didn't understand the words, but I knew what was coming. I touched my hair one last time. After that day, I never touched it again for a year. I couldn't." The imagery is consistent across testimonies. Dim rooms, scissors that pulled, laughter outside, no mirrors inside. For many, that moment became the most vivid memory of captivity. Not the interrogation, not the hunger, not even the loss of uniform. The body forgets cold. It forgets hunger, but it remembers shame, especially when it falls to the floor in golden strands. While the emotional and cultural shock of forced haircutting left deep scars on individual prisoners, the practice also reveals broader patterns in military policy, post-war politics, and gender dynamics within Allied occupation strategy. To understand why the scissors came out, one must look not just at hygiene protocols or cultural values, but at how power was being realigned and how gender became a battlefield of its own. By 1945, the Allied armies, British, American, French, and Soviet, had captured millions of German personnel. But unlike in 1918, this time they encountered something unprecedented: thousands of women in uniform. Many of these women had served in combat-adjacent roles: radio operators, flight coordinators, map analysts, anti-aircraft auxiliaries. A few, particularly in the Waffen-SS female units, had guarded concentration camps or participated in prisoner processing. For the Allied command, this blurred the line between soldier and civilian. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which governed POW rights, had no clear provisions for female combatants, because female combatants had never existed in such numbers. The Allied forces, particularly the British and Americans, were forced to improvise policy on how to house, interrogate, and manage these prisoners. Haircutting in this context became one of many disciplinary procedures aimed at enforcing military order within newly improvised camps. The act was often grouped with delousing, uniform seizure, and physical searches. In memos exchanged between Allied camp commanders, there is no evidence of deliberate cruelty, but there is frequent frustration. Reports describe the women as arrogant, still ideological, or emotionally uncooperative. To soldiers returning from the front lines, these women, often captured in pristine offices with typewriters and files, represented an unrepentant face of Nazism. And when they refused to answer questions, salute properly, or renounce Hitler, the impulse to assert control grew stronger. Control in military systems begins with uniformity. Uniformity begins with the body. The treatment of female German POWs, and whether or not their hair was cut, varied dramatically depending on the nation running the camp. St. British zones, particularly in Italy and Western Germany, often enforced short haircuts as part of standard delousing. These were usually done without ceremony, but not without emotional cost. American camps were somewhat less strict. In some cases, women were allowed to tie their hair, or were only required to shorten it modestly. American officers, influenced by public relations concerns and aware of press scrutiny, sought to avoid overtly punitive measures unless the woman was tied to war crimes. French camps, particularly in the aftermath of German occupation, were the most emotionally charged. In several documented cases, German women were publicly humiliated, not always under formal orders, but with community involvement. In liberated French towns, civilians shaved the heads of German women accused of fraternization or collaboration, a deeply symbolic act meant to mark them as traitors. Soviet zones saw the most brutal approach. Captured women, regardless of role, were often subjected to systemic violence, including rape, forced labor, and summary hair removal. In Soviet doctrine, German female captives were not auxiliaries. They were fascists, and fascism, in Soviet eyes, had no gender. The scissors in each zone carried a different weight, but everywhere they marked the end of a woman's wartime role, and the beginning of something else. Men were disarmed. Women were disrobed. The defeat of Nazi Germany involved more than military surrender. It involved the unraveling of ideology, and that ideology had placed women in specific idealized roles: mother, supporter, loyal daughter of the Reich. To dismantle Nazism meant, in part, to dismantle those identities. And so, in the post-war camps, women were not simply processed. They were reprocessed, stripped of uniforms, stripped of rank, stripped of hair. Male prisoners of war faced long marches, forced labor, or interrogations about battlefield activity. Female POWs, many of whom had served behind desks or in bunkers, were instead subjected to symbolic unmaking. No titles, no ranks, no hairstyle. It was a different kind of disarmament, one aimed at the ego. There is one final angle worth examining: the politics of symbolism. In the early months of the occupation, Allied authorities knew that every photo, every testimony, every action would shape post-war memory. How Germany surrendered, and how it was treated afterward, would become part of the narrative. Haircutting, while seemingly minor, became a quiet message. You are no longer who you were. Not a soldier, not a nationalist, not a symbol of German pride. You are now under our rules, and those rules begin with the body. It was control without violence, power without blood, and for many prisoners, that made it harder to fight. There were no guards with rifles shouting commands, only nurses with scissors. And that, in its subtle precision, was perhaps the most devastating weapon of all. Hair grows back, but something else, something internal, does not. It began with a clipboard. In the early days of May 1945, a British staff sergeant walked into the command post of Camp Rimini, a sprawling temporary internment zone in northern Italy. Nestled in the remnants of an old Italian barracks complex, the camp was designed to hold thousands of surrendered German personnel. Among them, hundreds of women from the Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht, and SS Auxiliary Corps. The sergeant had received a report from the camp's medical officer. Multiple lice outbreaks had been detected in barracks 12 and 14, both housing female prisoners. The officer's recommendation was clear: immediate hygienic action, uniform laundering, delousing, hair to be trimmed short to prevent reinfestation. Within hours, the command post issued a camp-wide hygiene order. It was signed off by a British colonel, noted as Standard Protocol, Female Internment Section. At first, few paid attention. Similar orders had been issued in other camps for both men and women, but this time the effect would be different. On May 7, 1945, the women in Block 14 were woken before dawn. Guards entered with translators. A notice was read aloud in German. For hygiene purposes, all hair must be trimmed to standard regulation length. Compliance is required. Medical staff will proceed barracks by barracks. There was no mention of punishment, no threats, just an order: cold, clinical, emotionless. The British camp nurse assigned to the task, Corporal Ruth Lister, had expected resistance. She did not expect the silence. The first woman who sat before her was a former radar operator, still wearing a patched Luftwaffe sleeve. Her posture was straight. Her braid reached mid-back. When Lister asked her to lean forward, she didn't move. She looked at me, Lister later recalled in a personal letter, and then she undid her braid with both hands, slowly, like it was the last thing she had control over. The scissors weren't sharp enough. The first cut tugged more than it sliced. The woman flinched. Then came the sound. Not loud, but final. Hair hitting concrete. In the hallway outside, other prisoners watched in silence. Some turned away, a few clenched fists. Most stood motionless, arms crossed over gray tunics. There was no physical violence, no shouting, just the rhythmic sound of scissors moving from scalp to floor. One by one, each woman sat, endured, and left. Their heads uneven, their expressions locked in a kind of stoic defeat. Some tried to cut their own hair beforehand, seeking dignity in control. Others refused and were escorted by guards, forced to comply under military authority. By sundown, nearly 80 women had been processed. The British reports from that day note compliance. One entry reads, "Hair trimming operation completed in blocks 12 to 14. Minimal disruption. Psychological impact observed, but not disruptive." But among the prisoners, the impact ran deeper. Later interviewed by German Red Cross staff, described the moment bluntly. "They did not hit us. They did not starve us. But when they cut our hair, I knew I was no longer a person. I was a number another." Writing in a secret diary smuggled home after release, simply wrote, "7 May, I am gone." The next day, the order expanded. Camps across the region received word from British military health branches recommending short haircuts for all female detainees as part of preventive sanitation. The same directive was relayed to Camp 2227 in Rennes, where a French-British joint command had taken control of captured German women. At Rennes, the policy was enforced with more rigidity. Women suspected of SS affiliation were not just trimmed. They were shaved bald. These were not hygiene measures alone, but public punishments carried out in front of other prisoners. What began as sanitation had now shifted into something darker, a symbolic break, a psychological tool. And the scissors, once wielded with medical caution, were now a weapon of silence. The war had officially ended on May 8, 1945, VE Day. But inside the camps, for many of these women, the true end came not with the German surrender, but with the sound of scissors clicking behind them, stripping away the last thing they still called their own. The women didn't speak for days. After the hair-cutting order was executed across Rimini and other British-controlled camps, something in the atmosphere changed. Guards noticed it. Nurses felt it. Interrogators recorded it. The female prisoners had become quiet, mechanical, blank, but not because they were broken by interrogation or hunger. It was something else. a kind of internal collapse, the moment when identity dissolves not through violence, but through ritualized humiliation. And the most devastating part? It was done in absolute order. No screams, no chaos, just the orderly removal of dignity. After the hair was gone, the next step was uniforms. Women who had been captured in full military dress, Luftwaffe signalers, Wehrmacht secretaries, even SS female staff, were stripped of insignia. Their coats were burned or stored. Many were given shapeless gray garments pulled from surplus Red Cross or British inventory. These clothes were not sized, not styled, not suited to the body. They were tools of uniformity. Name tags were replaced with numbers. Rank was erased. Titles were ignored. Women who once commanded logistics offices or trained in specialized military academies now queued for ration tins, squatted in shared latrines, and waited for inspection like invisible echoes of their former selves. In Camp Rimini, a British chaplain recorded in his journal, "The haircutting seemed small at first, but after it, many stopped looking others in the eye. They no longer sat straight. A kind of collective shame set in, as if they had been unmasked in front of each other." The psychological dismantling didn't end with the haircut. Within days, Allied authorities began implementing structured re-education programs. At Camp 2227, a French-British task force ran evening sessions in which prisoners were shown films of the liberated camps, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz. Survivors' testimonies were read aloud. German women, many still reeling from their personal losses and disorientation, were made to watch what the Reich had become. In some sessions, they were asked to write essays or confessionals afterward. Others were simply interrogated on their reactions. Those who cried were noted. Those who remained stoic were marked for further questioning. But what struck the Allied staff most was not defiance, it was emotional numbness. They stared at the screen with hollow expressions, one British officer noted, as if they no longer recognized the country they had served or the people they had once believed in, and part of that detachment stemmed from self-displacement. The women could no longer see themselves in the reflection of Germany, but they could no longer see themselves either. There were no mirrors in most of these camps. The only glimpses of reflection came from water basins, polished tin cups, or glass shards in shattered windows. Even that was rare. For some women, that was intentional. One diary recovered from a former SS typist reads, "I did not want to see my face. I did not want to see what they had made me, or what I had allowed myself to become." Among the hardest hit were female officers, particularly those from the Luftwaffe auxiliary services. Many had volunteered in their teens, trained at military schools, and risen to positions of command over communications hubs or anti-aircraft coordination units. They had studied signals, logistics, enemy aircraft identification, and now they were called only by bunk numbers. Some tried to retain military posture, standing during roll calls, saluting out of habit. But those habits faded quickly. Without hair, without uniform, without acknowledgement, even the strongest internal discipline eroded. One British psychologist stationed at a women's holding facility in Belgium wrote, "There was no brutality in our camp. And yet I watched women age 10 years in 2 weeks. They moved like ghosts. When I asked one her name, she answered, 'I'm no one now.'" The Nazi regime had taught German women that obedience was strength, to the fatherland, to the Führer, to the image of the perfect German woman. Many of those captured still clung to that belief, even if only in posture. But the Allied camps flipped that obedience on its head. Now, obedience meant surrender your uniform, accept your number, submit to a haircut, listen without reply, watch the crimes you were part of. And in this reversal, identity fractured. Some prisoners accepted it. Others resisted quietly. A few withdrew completely, refusing to speak, to eat, to acknowledge. These silent resistors were often flagged for medical observation. Some were placed in isolation. A few, documented in medical logs, were eventually transferred to psychiatric facilities for what Allied doctors called trauma-induced identity collapse. The scissors had cut more than hair. They had cut the link between past and present, between soldier and prisoner, woman and number, self and shame. And for many German women in those silent camps, that cut never fully healed. As the summer of 1945 gave way to autumn, the Allied camps began to shift focus. The war was over. The front lines had vanished. Nazi Germany was no more. But across dozens of military-run facilities scattered from Italy to France to Germany's own ruined interior, tens of thousands of German women remained behind barbed wire, in a kind of limbo. Neither civilians nor criminals, no longer soldiers, but not yet free. The question now became, what should be done with them? Allied High Command issued revised instructions in late 1945 for the processing and classification of female detainees. Each woman was to be reviewed under 3 categories: war criminal or collaborator, active service member or auxiliary civilian employee, or conscripted worker. Those accused of war crimes, particularly former female guards from concentration camps like Ravensbrück or Bergen-Belsen, were held for formal prosecution. A few, such as Irma Grace and Elisabeth Volkenrath, would become infamous, publicly tried and sentenced by British military tribunals. But they were the minority. The vast majority of German women in Allied custody had served in support roles: typing, radio dispatch, logistics, communications, clerical duties. Some were teenagers. Others had joined under conscription policies enacted in 1943 and 1944 as the Nazi war machine grew desperate for manpower. And yet, even among those cleared of direct wrongdoing, release did not come quickly. For months, many women remained confined in military camps, not because they posed danger, but because the Allied bureaucracy was overwhelmed. In Camp 2227 in France, records show that some women were held for over 14 months before release. In Italy's Rimini sector, hundreds of German female auxiliaries remained in captivity well into late 1946, assigned to forced labor tasks such as laundry, food service, or facility maintenance. They were no longer prisoners of war in the legal sense, but they were not free citizens either. Camp logs from British staff describe their status as retained for security and stabilization purposes. One document from the British War Office in October 1945 reads, "The ideological threat posed by unprocessed female auxiliaries remains significant. Their release into occupied zones may contribute to subversive organization or revanchist propaganda." In effect, the women were held as precautionary measures, symbols of a regime that had to be fully erased before they could return to public life. In some instances, female prisoners demanded clarity, asking for legal representation, formal charges, or repatriation. Most requests were denied or ignored. The Allies, focused on larger objectives like the Nuremberg trials and the partitioning of Germany, viewed these individual cases as low priority. Even those women who had committed no proven crimes found themselves marked by suspicion. A former Luftwaffe auxiliary held in British custody for 11 months later recounted, "I had never touched a weapon. I never saw a prisoner, but they told me I was part of the machine. So I stayed behind the wire, day after day, waiting for someone to say I could go." When the releases finally came, mostly in waves between late 1946 and 1947, they were subdued. There were no parades, no homecoming ceremonies, just a return to towns and villages now reduced to rubble, where silence had become survival. Many women returned to find their families dead, displaced, or shamed. Some tried to hide their pasts. Others were rejected entirely. The German public, especially in the Western zones, wanted to forget. The return of female POWs, particularly those who had served in uniform, posed an uncomfortable question. What had these women done? What had they seen? What had they supported? No one wanted to ask, and few dared to answer. As one released prisoner from Camp Rimini recalled, the camp had fences, but the silence at home was thicker. No one asked me where I had been. I never told them they had gone in with names, uniforms, and braids. They returned with cropped hair, faded numbers, and memories they could never speak aloud. Germany in the late 1940s was a country under reconstruction, not just of buildings and infrastructure, but of identity. Cities had been flattened, families shattered, and ideologies discredited. The entire concept of what it meant to be German was under review, both by the occupying Allies and the survivors themselves. But within that transformation, one group remained largely silent: the tens of thousands of women who had served the Reich and been imprisoned for it. They carried no medals, they received no honors, and for many, they carried the memory of humiliation so deeply that even decades later, they could not speak of it. In the immediate post-war years, the returning female POWs faced a hostile, often suspicious public. Unlike male soldiers, who were increasingly viewed as victims of Hitler's failed militarism, the women who had worked for the regime were seen as something far more ambiguous: collaborators, bureaucrats, even willing participants in an ideological system that had committed monstrous crimes. The question hung in the air: why had they joined? What had they done? Most women did not answer, not because they couldn't, but because no one wanted to hear it. In a 1958 study by the German Social Research Institute, researchers found that less than 4% of former female auxiliaries had shared their wartime experience with family or neighbors. Most chose silence. The reason, according to follow-up interviews, shame. Not just shame over Nazi ideology or complicity, but shame over how they had been treated after the war. One woman wrote anonymously to a newspaper in 1964, "I served in a signals unit. I believed in the war. I believed we were protecting Germany. But after the surrender, they shaved my head. They made me watch the camps. I wanted to die. And when I came home, no one would look at me. I wasn't a criminal, but I wasn't innocent either. I was forgotten." Unlike their male counterparts, very few female German POWs wrote memoirs. Those who did often downplayed or omitted the haircutting, the interrogations, the psychological toll. Even decades later, the trauma remained raw, not just because of what had happened during the war, but because of how identity had been forcibly dismantled in captivity. In the 1970s and 80s, as West Germany wrestled with its Nazi past, new generations of historians and feminists began asking deeper questions about women's roles in the Third Reich. Books such as Hitler's Furies would later explore the breadth of female participation, both willing and coerced. But even these works often struggled to capture the emotional interior of the women who had been prisoners. The memories were fragmented. The wounds, often hidden behind closed doors, resurfaced only in old age, and often only when nobody else was left to judge. In the final years of life, a handful of former female POWs began speaking, mostly in private recordings, university interviews, or anonymous letters to archives. They didn't seek forgiveness. They didn't claim innocence. They spoke only of what it felt like to become invisible, not in combat, but in surrender. One testimony, recorded in 1997 by a German oral history project, came from a woman who had served as a Luftwaffe radio operator. "I remember the scissors more than the uniforms. I remember the look on the nurse's face. Not anger, not cruelty, Just duty. She did what she was told. And I sat there, silent, letting go of the last piece of who I was. These voices are rare. Many left nothing behind. No memoir, no photograph, not even their real names. But within those few surviving testimonies lies a haunting truth. You don't need a bullet to break someone. Sometimes all it takes is a pair of scissors and a mirror that never returns your reflection. For the women who passed through those camps, history didn't record their stories in headlines. Their shame wasn't public. Their grief wasn't shared. But it was real, and it never left them. History often remembers war in terms of battles, treaties, and body counts. It documents victory through maps and defeat through surrender papers. But some losses leave no craters. Some battles leave no graves. For thousands of German women taken prisoner in 1945, defeat came not with tanks or rifles, but with scissors, silence, and shame. They were not generals. They were not frontline troops. Many had never fired a shot. Yet they became footnotes in a system of vengeance and policy, caught between justice and humiliation, guilt and erasure. The act of cutting hair, seemingly trivial in the shadow of war crimes and ruins, was, in many ways, a ritual of dismantling. It stripped not only lice and propaganda, but also identity, memory, and self-worth. And for those women, the deepest scars were not physical. They were psychological, inflicted in barracks without mirrors, where names faded into numbers and uniforms became shrouds. We must not romanticize them, nor must we erase them. Their silence was not innocence, but it was not always guilt either. They were raised in a world that told them obedience was virtue. And when that world collapsed, they paid the price not just for their actions, but for the system that taught them how to serve. Their stories remind us that defeat is not always a clean line between right and wrong, that sometimes, in war's aftermath, the very tools used to restore order can also deepen wounds. They remind us that power can be soft, quiet, and devastating. That memory is often buried beneath shame. And that history lives not just in documents, but in the faces we never saw again because they didn't want to be seen.